Hello and welcome to Clementine's Midnight Channel. This is Clementine. I am her identical twin sister, and we created this channel to talk about the theories of 20th century Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung and how those theories impacted our favorite video game series, Persona. Today, Clementine and I are wearing our best Chidori-inspired outfits because we're going to talk today about Chidori and Junpei, my favorite Persona relationship, and specifically about how Chidori and Junpei's relationship reflect the relationships between introverts and extroverts. So, to be clear, I don't think that the Jungian theory behind the introverted and extroverted attitudes is deliberately and overtly being incorporated by Atlas in the same way that Persona and Shadow and Collective Unconscious are. I think this is more of a case of the workings of the psyche that Jung identified naturally being projected into a work of fiction. And honestly, what could be more Jungian than that? Still, I think that this is an excellent chance for us to analyze a piece of Jungian theory using Persona and to analyze a piece of Persona using Jungian theory. And most importantly, it gives me a chance to talk about Chidori and Junpei, who I love more than anything. I will be quoting a couple of times in this video an essay by Jung that comes from this book, 2 essays on analytical psychology. The essay that I will be quoting is called, hold on, The Unconscious in the Normal and Pathological Mind. We will be specifically quoting from chapter 4, which is titled The 2 Psychological Types. The 2 psychological types being introvert and extrovert. So, introvert and extrovert are almost certainly already words in your regular vocabulary. You probably know which one you are, and you probably know which one most of your close friends and family members are as well. And while you are probably right about whether you are an introvert or an extrovert, you're probably wrong about why you are an introvert or an extrovert. Out of all of the aspects of the psyche that Jung put names and descriptions to, the introvert-extrovert binary is far and away the one that has traveled the furthest and become the most mainstream. Whenever something like this happens, though, we lose some of the original meaning and nuance of the concept as it gets passed down from generation to generation via a game of cultural telephone. To reduce introversion and extroversion to essentially a measure of how much you enjoy socializing is to strip them of their, well, most of their actual utility as labels. So let's talk about what introversion and extroversion actually are first. Now, the first quote I'm going to share from the essay that I just showed you is, "The extrovert always puts the accent upon the object and his relation to it. The introvert always upon the subject, freed as completely as possible from the object." The subject here is essentially I feel, I think, I want. And the object here is pretty much anyone or anything that is outside of the I, the conscious ego and its perspective. Junpei is an obvious extrovert. I don't think I have to work hard to convince anyone of this. Junpei is a doer. He wants to go to Tartarus. He wants to smash a watermelon with a baseball bat. He wants to talk to every new person he meets and find out what their deal is. Junpei wants to act upon the world and see what happens. He's less interested in interrogating why he wants to do those things, and he's not very interested in activities that are solely meant to enrich the inner world. He doesn't like talking about his difficult past or about his innermost feelings. He likes telling silly ghost stories to get a reaction out of people. Junpei, when we first meet him, is almost entirely focused on the object and his relation to it. Chidori is, I would say, a pathological introvert, and we can sort of measure her against Fuka, who is another extreme introvert, but one who is not introverted to the point of maladaptivity like Chidori is. Fuka is very shy, yes, but Chidori straight up does not want to be addressed by anyone. She's not invested in Strega's mission, but she's also not motivated to leave them and have to figure out how to interact with the world herself. She just waits to die, with only Medea to keep her company. I find it interesting that even though Chidori does interact with Medea and sort of see her as a friend, Medea is still an entity that exists within Chidori primarily as her persona. She's more a part of Chidori's inner world, than she is a part of Chidori's environment. And so interacting with her, I think, could still be regarded as an introverted act on Chidori's part. When we meet Chidori, just about every move she makes seems to be meant to free herself as completely as possible from the object and to focus her entire existence on just existing as a subject. So to make full sense of introversion and extroversion this way, we need to conceive of them as action types as opposed to being just passive states or identities. Just about anything we do could ostensibly be classified as introverted or extroverted, depending on whether the action is oriented inward or outward. So realizing that you're hungry and it's time for lunch would be an introverted act, even though extroverts do this every day. Feeding your pet cat her lunch would be an extroverted act, even when an introvert is doing it. Here's another quote from the essay. If we consider that no man is simply introverted or simply extroverted, but has potentialities for both attitudes, one having been developed as a function of adaptation, we shall immediately hazard the conjecture that in the introvert, extraversion lies sleeping and undeveloped in the background, as likewise in the extrovert, introversion has a meager and shadowy life. So our conscious experience is basically a series of inputs and outputs between the self and the environment. The introvert's attention naturally gravitates to the self side, the integration and the processing of all these inputs. And the extrovert's attention naturally gravitates toward the environment side, the effects and the reception of all their outputs. The goal in typing yourself as an introvert or an extrovert is to recognize that you're going to need some extra practice with the sleeping and undeveloped side of this dynamic, not to recuse yourself from it entirely. Introversion and extroversion are skills. One of them is going to be consciously easier and more comfortable for you, and the other will feel clumsier and less intuitive as you learn it. But you can learn it. Remember that the end goal of Jungian theory is to embody the complete and whole self. Part of that is going to be consciously developing your introverted or extroverted skill, depending on which one you're worse at. For what an idea of what this looks like, I think Mitsuru is a great example of a natural introvert who has a highly developed extroverted skill. When her father dies, she clearly wants to be alone and secluded from her environment to process and reflect. However, she has a number of extroverted duties as student council president and as heir to her father's company. She forces herself to come out for these duties and then returns to her solitude when she can. She clearly has a preference for introversion, but she's practiced enough in extraversion that she can engage in it even when she is under extreme stress. That's the goal, although it can be a lifelong challenge to get to that point. What I think makes Chidori and Junpei such excellent case studies in introversion and extroversion is that neither one of them has developed the opposite skill whatsoever. Chidori would rather pretend to be catatonic than engage with an unfamiliar environment, refusing to speak to anyone when she is in the hospital. Junpei has probably never self-reflected a day in his life before meeting Chidori. And while I'm still a student and not an actual psychologist, so I'm not qualified to speak in depth on the effects of trauma, I don't think this conversation about Junpei and Chidori is going to be complete unless we at least acknowledge their traumatic backgrounds and how those are most likely contributing to the maladaptive natures of their respective extroversion and introversion. Junpei does not speak a lot about his childhood suffering, but at least to me, just about every choice he makes and every aspect of his personality feels like an attempt to prove to the world that he is not his deadbeat alcoholic father. I don't think being thought of as a hero is just an ego thing for Junpei. I think there's an unconscious drive there to differentiate himself from the man who made him. If Junpei were an introvert, or at least had somewhat developed his introverted skill, he might be able to see this in himself, and he might be more forthcoming about his past. But that kind of interior focus does not come naturally to him, and so he goes into the world and he acts without fully understanding or even caring why. It isn't until he becomes close with Chidori that we start seeing Junpei consider his actions before taking them. Now, Chidori, like the other Kirijo group victims, has suffered unspeakable things her whole life. Her suffering has left her with a wealth of rage, but that rage is directed back inward. Junpei is alarmed to discover that Chidori has been hurting herself, but who else is Chidori going to hurt? Medea's occasional bouts of violence against Chidori can be seen in the same vein. They are symbols of the psyche's rage and pain turned back against the self. When Chidori draws, it isn't to show the world what she sees. Her art is a mirror to her chaotic and scary inner world, and it isn't meant to be seen by anyone else. Chidori's environment is almost entirely incidental to her, likely because disassociating from it provides her with some level of emotional protection. It isn't until Junpei zeroes in on her and tries to pull her out of her shell that she starts to acknowledge anything outside of herself as being real and having meaning for her. And here we start to see what happens when an introvert and an extrovert collide, the good, the bad, and the ugly. A healthy relationship between two individuals of each type can be a beautiful thing. Jung himself says these types seem created for symbiosis, a life of reciprocal interdependence. The province of one is reflection, of the other initiative and practical dealing. When the two types are united in marriage, they may affect an ideal union. The introvert and the extrovert can help each other in their respective domains, and they can compensate for each other's shortcomings. But while opposites may attract for good reason, it isn't always going to be smooth sailing at first. In this same essay I've been quoting, Jung shares a little illustrative story as an example of the potential benefits and challenges in the introvert-extrovert relationship. Two young men, an introvert and an extrovert, are out on a walk together when they notice a building off in the distance that looks like an old castle. Both young men are intrigued by the castle, but when the extrovert exclaims that they should go check it out, the introvert hesitates. Maybe it's off limits. Maybe they could get in trouble if they get too close. Maybe it's dangerous. The extrovert convinces the introvert to get closer and go see before making those kinds of assumptions. So far, the young men are in symbiosis. The introvert's focus on self-preservation helps to temper the extrovert's recklessness, and the extrovert's insistence on exploring the object of interest ensures that the introvert's caution does not deny him the chance for discovery. However, once the pair reaches the castle, things start to change. Upon arrival, they discover that the old castle has been refashioned on the inside into a sort of library containing many old historical documents. The introvert, who happens to love history and particularly poring over historical documents, finds his attention pulled out of himself and onto the object. He enters a sort of clumsy state of extraversion, in which his attention is on the treasure trove of history in front of him, but he isn't able to incorporate his friend into that extraversion, leaving the friend behind entirely to focus just on the documents. The extrovert, who is not interested in history or reading, now finds himself neglected, bored, and idle with nothing to do but reflect. This state of introversion is not comfortable for him, and so he becomes sullen and irritated. You can imagine a scene here in which the two friends whose dynamic had been so beneficial just a few moments before are now at odds with each other. The extrovert whines and sulks, and the introvert tells him to shut up so he can focus on reading. The introvert-extrovert relationship can introduce these kinds of conflicts and growing pains when the two individuals are not practiced in their opposite types. This is exactly what we see in Junpei and Chidori's relationship as it first starts to develop. What starts as the familiar and often enjoyable push-pull dynamic starts to fall apart once Chidori is pulled into extraversion and Junpei is pushed into introversion. When Chidori realizes how much she cares about something outside of herself, how invested she has become in the object, she panics. She becomes cruel to Junpei and tells him to leave her alone. She tries to retreat back inside of herself, but of course her brush with extraversion has changed her and she can never fully go back anymore. This forces Junpei to introspect. He agonizes over whether he should go and see Chidori again or not. According to Jung, the extrovert usually acts first and then reflects on his action. Here, we see Junpei considering his actions before taking them for the first time, and he's not good at it. It pains and confuses him. Junpei and Chidori's interactions with each other have forced them outside of their usual action type, and since both of them are so unpracticed in the opposite type, it causes them both considerable discomfort. These are the growing pains of developing the self. After this awkward, uncomfortable phase of growth, however, we start to see the transformative power of self-development at work. Chidori's final sacrifice is an act of profound extraversion. She surrenders up her inner world entirely in order to revive Junpei after he is killed. The output here is her entire life force, and she sends it off without a thought for Junpei's sake. She sacrifices the subject to preserve the object. This is oppositional to the introvert's usual orientation. Junpei's response is to realize, with a little bit of coaxing from Akihiko, that his actions going forward are going to need consideration and reflection. Junpei wants to chase after Takaya and punish him for what he has wrought, but he stops himself from pursuing the object and reorients his focus on preserving the subject. Every second of life Junpei has from now on is a gift from Chidori. What he does with each one of those seconds means something more to him now. And what's more is his inner world is the place that he will carry Chidori along with him as his persona integrates Chidori's. The inner world now has an importance to Junpei that it never did before, just as the outer world became significant to Chidori through this relationship. I'm not here to talk about mythology per se, but I do think we should briefly discuss Junpei's personas. Before Chidori's sacrifice, Junpei's persona is Hermes. Known for being young, swift, and chatty, Hermes is a pretty apt symbol for extraversion, I think. Always on the go, always with a message to share. But when Medea joins Hermes after Chidori's sacrifice, we get a persona for Junpei called Trismegistus, which can only be a reference to Hermes Trismegistus, who is a sort of Hellenistic-era Frankenstein god created by fusing aspects of Egyptian and Greek mythology. Despite the Hermes in his name, Hermes Trismegistus is archetypally very different from just plain Hermes. Hermes Trismegistus is one of the faces of the wise old man archetype. He was envisioned as an elderly sage, an erudite scholar, and if you've heard the term Hermeticism before, that was an entire philosophy / religion that was centered around what were regarded to be the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. Hermeticism and Hermes Trismegistus also happened to be very important to the Gnostic alchemists that Jung studied quite a lot while he was developing his theories. The Gnostic alchemists had a lot to say about inner growth and reflection and self-development, which are some of the most introverted activities possible. Hermeticism is quite dense and esoteric, and generally the kind of thing that only an introvert would find as appealing as Jung did. So in addition to being a symbol of Junpei's character development due to his relationship with Chidori, Trismegistus is also just another cool little nod to Jungian lore, the likes of which we see all the time in Persona. Also, another random semi-related fun fact, theurgy is a concept that is explored in Hermetic texts and is strongly associated with Hermeticism, although not exclusively. Theurgy is kind of a general magical concept that shows up in a lot of theologies, but I did think it was interesting that it was so relevant to Hermeticism and that it shows up in Persona 3 Reload. Also, the traditional depiction of the Tarot's Magician Arcana, which is canonically Junpei's Arcana, uses specifically Hermetic symbolism. The magician raises his wand to the sky and also points down to the ground. This is a reference to the Hermetic saying, "as above, so below." We don't really need to get into all of this, but basically, the specific choice for Junpei's persona evolution is not incidental. It is perhaps even more than Orpheus, integral to the individuation story that Persona 3 is trying to tell us. Hermes Trismegistus is not the kind of guy that you'd associate Junpei with, and yet he is Junpei's persona after his relationship with Chidori transforms him, and he integrates a new introverted side to himself. If you play the FemC route in Persona 3 Portable, you can end up with a scene with Junpei in which you can confess having feelings for him. And if you do, he will tell you that he's not ready to be with someone yet after what happened with Chidori. This minor scene that most Persona 3 players will never even see is nevertheless a poignant insight into the interior change that Junpei has undergone. I mean, can you imagine early game Junpei turning down a girl because he's not in a good emotional place to be with her? This is clear evidence that Junpei has well and truly begun to develop his introverted abilities sincerely. I think the reveal of Chidori's drawing of Junpei is similarly significant. Whereas before she drew these abstract depictions of her internal life, this is a loving portrait of the object through which Chidori has shown us that she has begun to consider something outside of herself and her relationship to that something to be as important to her as the internal world. In my first video about the Jungian theory that defines persona as a series, I spoke about individuation, the process of becoming the most complete and whole self by incorporating those unfamiliar or repressed parts of the unconscious self. I also spoke about how important it is to not limit the self with labels and categories that may prevent you from doing the work to become the full self. So I want to close this by emphasizing that while introvert and extrovert can be helpful labels to understand the way our conscious egos prefer to work, they are not meant to be restrictive categories, which is how I fear I often see them being used. Being an introvert does not mean that you are excused from doing extroverted things. If anything, it means you need to work harder at developing your extraversion. Being an extrovert does not excuse you from exercising reflection and caution. It means you're going to have to develop the habit of checking yourself quite a lot. I am a consummate introvert. I have scared people before with my ability to just sit still for hours with only my inner world to entertain me. Over the last few years, however, I have made an intentional effort to develop my extroverted abilities, and I can say my life is infinitely better for this. I can't recommend it enough. Not just because living in a society requires a certain level of extraversion to be fully adaptive, but because the inner world is also enhanced by developing relationships with the outer world. To my fellow introverts who may be looking to expand, I would recommend to you a couple of things. First, I think that you should have at least one hobby that involves physical, practical, external work. For me, I like to bake and I like to sew quilts. It's really good for me to spend time locked in on something tangible that is outside of myself and my brain. It may seem small, but it's still really good practice. I also recommend interacting with strangers regularly. And I don't mean you need to start pouring out your life story to the guy at the bus stop, but you should go through a cashier's checkout line at the grocery store and ask her about her day instead of using self-checkout with the headphones on so you don't have to talk to anyone. These are little things, but they're a great place to start. I've never been an extrovert, but for you guys, I'd imagine something like starting a daily journal or a regular meditation practice might be good places to start practicing introversion. And I'm also willing to bet that a better relationship with the inner world will also significantly enhance your relationships with the outside world. The important thing is that we remember that introversion and extroversion should not be excuses to limit ourselves. Think of Junpei and Chidori and how much they would have missed if they hadn't been brave enough to leave their comfort zones for each other. If you can't do it for yourself, then do it for them.